Dallin.
Pedro, thank you.
Welcome.
No, I don't know whether it's the 6 Portuguese coffees I had in the last 3 hours or 300 international faces staring up at me that's making me a little bit nervous. So just, Pedro, thank you for the introduction. The titles are very much grander than they sound, but they definitely are the way I'd like them to be in reality. Very 2 quick apologies at the start. Firstly, for my appalling Portuguese. Those of you joining me for a glass of wine later will find out exactly how bad it is. Bebes vinho, falas tudo. Now bebes vinho, now falas nada. And secondly, by the way, Barry Alto is a fantastic place to learn Portuguese. I've never seen a language school like it. And secondly, for the use of notes. Now, I'm notoriously bad at 2 things. 1, timing, and secondly, following rules. So being on stage with a ticking clock and a hammer hanging over my head is definitely asking for trouble. So let's stick to the notes for the sake of timekeeping. I want to take you back to October the 27th, 1972, when a family of 3 arrived at a makeshift refugee camp in the UK. The father, very badly dressed for the rainy, cold season, still wearing a short-sleeved orange and yellow fluorescent floral shirt, and I'm glad I can't see any of those in the audience right now. The mother and the son obviously wrapped up warm, and the son clinging tightly to his mother, not really knowing what was going on in the new surroundings. Houses and gardens replaced by tents, no food, no milk, and nothing in the way of equatorial sunshine to keep the young lad's skin warm. Now, that was 1972. Clearly, that wasn't me, you can tell. But that was the way that my family, my mother, my father, and my eldest brother arrived in the UK. Prior to that, home was a place called Uganda, a lush, green, hilly country located on the northern shores of Lake Victoria, a fantastic place. But as you can imagine, the hurried exit they had in 1972 as refugees meant that they didn't ever get to go back. Fast forward then to May 2008. A young man steps off a British Airways flight at Entebbe Airport, probably treading the same pathway that his father and his mother and his brother had trodden on all those years ago, feeling like, what am I doing here? I've been invited to speak at an event, an ICT event being held in Uganda, 2,500 miles away from the nearest Starbucks, which was obviously not something that's easily handled. And I just couldn't get, on my arrival to Africa, I couldn't get the stereotypical media images out of my head. You know, I'm coming to a place where starvation is rife, where showers can only be done through buckets, where children are soldiers, and all these complex ideologies that had been really driven into me by the media, and I guess into all of us. But actually, my total ignorance about Africa made sure that what I saw at that ICT event back in May 2008 was a real surprise, a positive surprise about what is going on in Africa. You know, I saw a vice president who spoke absolutely passionately about new wealth creation policies that would make doing business in Uganda much easier, much more transparent. This in itself was a surprise. I saw positive, sharp, innovative, creative individuals leading companies that could compete on a global stage, and certainly were generating revenues that were impressive enough to be listed on big stock markets. I saw ministers from across the continent who were concerned about the balance between policy, regulation, service delivery. These are all the business concerns that we see in developed economies, all the same things being discussed that are discussed in boardrooms in the US, in the UK, and across Europe. And those same topics are being discussed in Africa. Now, I guess for some of you guys, the links back to Mozambique and Angola may have shed light on some of those issues already in the business sense, but for me, a guy who'd only ever seen media images, this was really, really new to me. One of the things that really has continued to perplex me is the Africanness of doing business in Africa. I think elsewhere across the world, if you're in a big organization, it's pretty generic. It's pinstripe suits, it's board meetings, it's the same kind of discussions going on. But in Africa, there is a sense of culture that pervades everything. Something got me, and right then and there, I decided that, really, it has to be here, that the future is really, really here. Ignorance and confusion still plentiful. I'm watching the clock. I've got to really, really speed up. But I've come to realize that the ignorance and confusion is the norm for outsiders in Africa. And that instinct reflects a real contradictory story of evolution across the continent. There is a desire for Western-style development, which sits side by side with really strong local values and customs that place immense importance on tradition and family values. Visions for modern-day tools, such as mobile phones and internet, sit side by side with old traditional norms of communication, and they really do work in harmony together. I've not seen anything like it elsewhere in the world, where you can have old traditional norms that are not displaced but added to by modern-day technology. And one thing I realized through the 3 years of working in Africa is that you can't go one day in an office or in a working environment in Africa without clapping hands, slapping backs, high-fiving, storytelling, knowledge sharing. It's a really vibrant culture. Now, going back to the Square Mile in London and trying to high-five the CEO of a FTSE 250 company, you will get ejected out of the building really, really quickly. They'll think you're a hoodie in disguise. So it's a very different environment in which to operate. But this level and style of interaction creates a sense of, I'm hesitant to use the word innovation after everybody's just really dissed it, but actually they are joining dots in different ways, and this is innovation at the front line of the greatest need. And that closeness, that knowledge sharing, that bonding really does help Africans across the continent to drive towards and to persevere in business and move forward to free themselves from what are the shackles of aid dependency. And that's really where we draw to next, that despite all the great things that are happening across the continent, and despite all the amazing people that are moving businesses forward, in the 35 years since my parents left Uganda, a lot of development efforts have really failed to take hold, both in East Africa and the wider continent. And I wondered why this was. How could you have such intelligent, such motivated, such driven individuals working longer days than we're used to back in London? The kind of life in the countries that I visited in Africa, which is not the majority by any stretch, but life starts generally around 5:30 and is going right the way through till about 1:30. And that doesn't include late dinners and wine-fueled evenings in the bar, but it is in front of the laptop, it is at school, it is out on the fields. And it was only when I was driving through some of the hillier areas of Rwanda. On the outskirts of Kigali, there's a number of coffee plantations, there's a number of banana plantations. And I'm driving through these with one of our clients, and I start to realize some possible reasons for why these guys aren't succeeding. Aid boards. Every few hundred yards, you get a board that exclaims how great and how much aid is being received by that area. We're helping you, we're here to help you, we're giving you education, we're giving you water, we're giving you life. Life is our gift to you. And it got me thinking, are we seriously saying that before aid agencies came to the help of Africa, that indigenous populations couldn't take raw materials and convert them to usable goods, couldn't engage in trade, couldn't go and get water from the well, couldn't educate themselves, couldn't knowledge share, couldn't innovate, couldn't be creative? Is this all down to the aid agencies? I think from my tone you'll probably guess where I stand on that argument. Now, just to clarify, I do believe that aid started as a genuine desire to redistribute wealth, but I do think there's a massive disconnect between the amount of aid that's been given to Africa and the impact it's having on nations in the sense of really long-term, sustainable, consistent, and profitable economic growth. There's a massive disparity between the two. And this is kind of shown on national balance sheets. Now, I don't believe that anybody would suggest that young children are born with the self-belief that, I can't do anything without aid. I've got to go out on the streets and I've got to beg. I'm never going to get an education. Nobody's born with that almost sense of worthlessness. But if you see enough of these boards, soon enough you'll start to think, maybe I do need this. Maybe I am dependent on this. And right now, although the clock's ticking, I've got to tell you a quick one. When I was young, my father always used to convince me that those two small wheels on the back of my bicycle to help me balance, I just didn't need them. It was me that was balancing. And even when I fell off and scraped my knee and, scraped myself up and was bleeding and crying, he would convince me it must have been the grass under the wheel, not the fact that I haven't got enough balance to stay on the bike. In the same way, my mother used to convince me that, you're much better at doing mental arithmetic than a calculator. How can that be? But they convinced me that this was the case. And for a young guy, that kind of level of commitment and support and positive feedback was all important. But when did you ever hear of a news story that proclaimed Africa as, well done guys, you can do it, that proclaimed African people as resilient, self-fulfilling guys? That's never the case. The World Cup brought an element of that, but that was quickly displaced by some of the other negative stories that came out. There are more positive images coming to fore, education, banking, but actually there's not enough. So, very, very quickly, oddly, there are more poor people living under the breadline in Asia than there are in Africa, but for some reason, and we kind of believe that this is because Africa's problems can be compartmentalized, Africa receives a much greater share of aid than anywhere else in the world. As a reflection of that, and as a reflection of what we're just talking about, how aid doesn't really help long term, it is the least well-developed economic power, despite having some of the most mineral resources in the planet. A guy called Paul Theroux talks about mythomaniacs. These are famous celebrities that want to prove their worth to the world. And in a New York Times article way back in 2005, he spoke about a number of celebrities and how they were really perpetuating the notion that Africa is a reliant continent. And remember, it's made up of 50-plus countries, so it's not a country, but Africa as a continent is reliant on aid. And this is hugely damaging. So, flicking very quickly through. There's 30% of sub-Saharan Africa is malnourished, but food grows everywhere, absolutely everywhere. Coffee trees grow without any cultivation at all. One of the most expensive products to buy on the shelves. I mentioned Starbucks. You go and pay €4, €4.50 for a large soy milk latte, whatever it is that you drink, and coffee grows without any cultivation at all. So clearly there's a disparity and a mismatch somewhere. So if it's not aid that's helping, what is it that's helping? What has made that difference to development levels? Throughout my short time there, 3 years we've been working in Africa, we've really seen that governments, individuals, communities are now seeing through the aid, they're seeing through the cloak and daggers, and they're now seeing that actually it's aid that's repressed them, it's aid that's helped them back. And they're going through and doing some really, really great stuff on their own. Now, what does all of this mean for us? Let me get to the point, 2 minutes over time. What does all of this mean for us? And why am I standing here, putting myself in the firing line of every international aid agency, of every mythomaniac pop star that's watching on the live feed that Andre and his team have set up? Quite simply that Africa is open for business. And there's a documentary made. It's a fantastic documentary. YouTube it, you'll find it. Africa is open for business, and I would encourage anybody with a balance of social and corporate responsibility to go ahead and explore what business you can do in Africa. Some of the things that I talk about as a performance coach and as a consultant is it's not giving, it's not helping in the fluffy sense. It's going there with a mind to make money, and it's going there with a mind to try and displace some of what you know onto this continent. So as a performance coach and a consultant, we transfer skills. Quickly through some projects, Makerere University, 5,000 students in an ICT facility. Paul Kagame's inauguration in Rwanda just a few weeks ago, fantastic event where you see such a passion and public support for strong leadership. Paul Kagame has set up an organization called the Rwanda Development Board. It is a gateway into Rwanda. It is a real helping source for anybody that wants to do business there. another 7 years in term. And it's not just people in power that are making a difference. This guy here, Frank Mukama, is the country director for an organization called Yes Rwanda. Yes are putting in place the political and the advocacy measures needed to create 200,000 new jobs in Rwanda in the next 4 years. 200,000 new jobs. You're talking the size of a small city in the UK. That is a phenomenal, phenomenal number of jobs. And they're already well on the way. Such is Rwanda's attraction that people like RDB have set up IT divisions to bridge the digital divide. They send out internet buses to rural villages that don't have internet, so all of a sudden Rwanda is connected to the rest of the world. As business people going over there, we can still be connected to the rest of the world. We can still update Twitter, we can still check Facebook, we can still do all the stuff that we do here. The Private Sector Federation in Rwanda is another great organization that links private sector organizations to successful and sustainable business. International organizations, philanthropist and entrepreneur, Andreas is the guy you can just see there. His halo seems to have fallen off and is covering his face. But he's gone to Rwanda with a project in mind 3 years ago to set up the Rwanda Institute of Leadership and Entrepreneurship. This facility is an absolute world-class educational facility. It's a multi-million-dollar project that starts construction in February. Funding is agreed, courses are written. It is a superb facility. And anybody that thinks previously, because they don't have schools, let's give them a couple of blackboards and a few desks, and that will do them. Andreas took totally the opposite end of the extreme. They don't have schools and colleges, let's go and build world-class facilities.
Dillon, so, I'm going to ask you to conclude your presentation,
please. Finish slides. So all I'm saying is, really these guys need a sustainable economy for a sustainable future. I genuinely believe that business in Africa is a worthwhile and commercially lucrative cause, and I would encourage anybody here in the room to explore Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.